Welcome to the Cody Felger Podcast, a podcast dedicated to talking Colts football. Here is your host, Cody Felger.
Welcome back to the Cody Felger Podcast. On with me again, Derek Larger, as usual. And on Wednesday, the Colts reported to training camp and start practice officially on Thursday for their first practice of the year. And a lot of amazing things are coming now. You know, the offseason's officially now looking over, and now the Colts are back to work. And I thought, Derek, today that we could look at a couple positions that we think are going to be storylines heading into this training camp, this season for the Colts. And I thought that we could start first on looking at the offensive side of the ball. One position group that I think is going to be really, really hard to trim down. There's a lot of guys fighting for a few positions, and that's the wide receiver position. And Derek, there's a lot of players, like I mentioned, who are players that, you know, made significant plays for the Colts last year. But some were injured. Others, you know, are coming back for year 2 or year 3, and so there's a lot of players that could potentially and will be, unfortunately, on the outside looking in. And so, Derek, I thought that we could start by talking about the guys. I think the 3 guys that we can probably call for sure locks for this Colts 2019 season, barring any injury. Knock on wood with that. So the first guy, obviously, is T.Y. Hilton, you know, the guy that's been the Colts' #1 receiver ever since he was drafted in the 3rd round of the 2012 draft, the same draft as Andrew Luck. And T.Y. Hilton has just been a rock, Derek. And I guess we can talk about Hilton and just what he can bring, I guess, to these guys that have, you know, these new additions to the Colts, and all these young guys for the Colts heading into training camp and into 2019 and beyond.
Yeah, you're definitely right to talk about T.Y. Hilton first. I've read several quotes from him to the media recently about how this is the most humble and the most special team that he has ever been a part of, because just the young guys wanting to learn so much and the connection that they all have already. He already talked about Campbell talking with T.Y. Hilton constantly. He's always wanting to learn. He's always wanting to ask questions to T.Y. Hilton, which Hilton absolutely loves. He loves to teach these young guys. And he just keeps talking about Campbell's speed, just the speed that you can't teach. And in regards to what T.Y. will bring this next year, we certainly hope he can stay healthy, because when he stays healthy, that dude is just an absolute rock, and he's the easy #1 guy. And definitely he'll have more time to possibly rest this year if the Colts get a few packages where they can get T.Y. off the field for a few plays. Definitely will help him further down the season. But yeah, T.Y. especially, you know, he is going into many years now. He is 30 years old. Health has been an issue for him. I really hope that he continues to play well. I don't know what his stats entail this year, because like you said, we're going to be talking about what receivers will make the roster and how many precisely we actually think will make it. But ultimately, it is great to hear T.Y. Hilton talking about, you know, all these new receivers coming into the Colts, being humble, being wise, asking questions, wanting to learn more. It's definitely a great sign for the Colts for the preseason.
Yeah, and man, it's crazy because I just looked at, man, this is going to be T.Y. Hilton's 8th season. My goodness, it seems like the time has flown by for T.Y. Hilton, but I wanted to read a few quotes from Hilton now on some of these guys and just the leadership that he brings to this Colts wide receiver group. You know, like you mentioned, he was talking about Campbell, and this is a quote he had to say about Campbell. He said, "Speed, and he's always willing to learn, always asking me questions," and I like that, because I was doing the same to Reggie when I got here. That being Reggie Wayne, of course, the Colts, Pro Bowl wide receiver for so many years. And so it's cool now to see, you know, Marvin taught Reggie. Now Reggie taught T.Y., and now T.Y. is teaching Campbell. It's kind of cool how the Colts have had this basically since Marvin Harrison was with the Colts so many years ago. The Colts have had this wide receiver #1 who is teaching other receivers how to do, how to be pros, and it's a really cool thing. And another quote that I wanted to quote Mr. Hilton on really fast was, you know, just talking about this Colts 2019 team. He says, "This team is special. This team has enough to do what we want to do." And I even saw like another quote from Hilton basically saying like this is the most talented team he's ever been around. And so it's cool to see T.Y. Hilton taking that leadership role on seriously and wanting to train up these guys for the future because like you mentioned, T.Y. Hilton battled some injuries last year, on that same ankle, I think an upper and lower ankle injury. And he just turned 30, and so he's kind of getting up there in age. He's not old I wouldn't say he's old, but he's getting up there in age, and I think that's something that the Colts should have in the back of their mind. Like T.Y. Hilton's getting a little bit older, so it's good that they drafted a guy like Paris Campbell, and it's a good sign that T.Y. Hilton is wanting to train guys like Campbell up to be the kind of wide receiver that he has been for the Colts and that Reggie was for the Colts and that Marvin was for the Colts. It's cool to see that tradition being passed on and seeing those old veteran guys like T.Y. Hilton willing to just share with these rookies and share all their knowledge, and it's just a very cool thing. The next guy on our list is a guy that's new to the Colts. He is not a rookie, but he was brought over in free agency. He's a big guy, 6'4", about 220 pounds, brought over from the Carolina Panthers in free agency, and that's Devin Funchess. And Funchess has had he's had a very interesting career, I think, Derek, overall. I think a couple years ago the Panthers thought that he was going to be their number one wide receiver, and it looked like he was trending up towards that. And then he started getting some issues with, whether injuries or with inconsistencies. I know he started dropping a lot of passes last year, and that was a big deal. And so, Devin Funchess now enters, he has a new team around him, new coaches, new everything. And so it'll be interesting, Derek, to see what Devin Funchess brings to the Colts, because the Colts have really, throughout the Andrew Luck era, have really, besides a few players, I would say Donnie Avery and Dontrell Inman really have been the only solid, not even really that great, number two wide receivers for the Colts. And so a thing that they've lacked, I think, is a complement to T.Y. Hilton. Basically throughout T.Y. Hilton's career, throughout Andrew Luck's career, and throughout this entire era of Colts football. And so remains to be seen whether or not Devin Funchess will be that guy. But certainly, Derek, he's probably the most physically gifted, that is, number two wide receiver that the Colts have had in the Andrew Luck era.
Yeah, I agree with you. And Funchess has got to feel really good about being with the Indianapolis Colts. I view it kind of as what happened with Ebron. Ebron was in a situation where he wasn't getting the benefit of the doubt. Sure, he had his problems that he definitely could have worked on more. But ultimately, he was in a system that didn't really help him succeed and therefore didn't make the Lions succeed. But then he comes to the Indianapolis Colts where he has a better quarterback, a better offensive system, and a better opportunity to put himself in a position where he can succeed. And sure enough, we obviously saw the season that he had. Funchess is kind of in that same ordeal. The Panthers organization has never really been about throwing the football that much. It's always been a ground and pound offense, specifically with Cam Newton and whatever running back they had back there. And obviously now with their offense that they had, throwing the ball to Christian McCaffrey just as many times as anybody else, ultimately Funchess just wasn't getting put in a position to where his best attributes could come out and be able to help his team, which I definitely think is what the Colts are going to definitely do better, and especially with Andrew Luck as the quarterback, who is a much better thrower, a more consistent thrower, a more accurate thrower, so which ultimately will put Funchess in a better position if Funchess does his work. And you're right, we have no idea what he's going to work. We're actually going to see from him. Funchess could be that red zone guy. He could have a more expanded role. We don't know. But I'll say it as again, like I said probably a couple weeks ago, if Funchess has anything of the impact that Eric Ebron had, then certainly Funchess is going to fit right in with this Indianapolis Colts offense.
Yeah, and I kind of think that there's going to be three things that happen to Funchess, three situations that Funchess could find himself in. Either he has an Eric Ebron type year where the Colts put him in position, it's a change of system, and he really just ascends to a new heights with the Colts. Or he could go, I always think, a guy that's similar with the whole drops early in the Andrew Luck era is a guy like Darius Hayward-Bay. I think he could either go, Eric Ebron type stats, or he could go Darius Hayward-Bay where he can't catch the football. Or I think he could go a little bit in between where, doesn't necessarily have, a terrible season. He doesn't necessarily have an Eric Ebron type season, but he's just kind of a solid guy. He's kind of like the Dontrell Inman, but a little bit bigger. Just another red zone threat for the Colts, but he doesn't explode like Ebron did last year. And so I think those are the three situations that he's going to find himself in. And I think ultimately it's up to a few factors. I think the first one is, can Funchess get out of his own head with the drops? Obviously drops are a huge thing for receivers, and that can get into their heads, and then they can only think, I'm just going to drop this pass. And I guess another thing is, how much will the Colts use him? What did they bring Devin Funchess in for? Are they going to bring him in? Is he going to be a guy that's on the field 80-90% of the snaps, or is he going to be a guy that's kind of used sparingly, kind of like an Ebron? I think with Jack Doyle last year getting injured, Eric Ebron really had to get a lot more snaps in because of the loss of Doyle. It was such a significant loss, and I think it could potentially be like that, with the guy we'll talk about next in Pierre Campbell. And I guess it's going to be interesting to see how the Colts use him, number one, and then if he can kind of bounce back from kind of a rough season last year in Carolina. And so the next guy I wanted to look at is a guy I just mentioned. The Colts drafted him this year out of Ohio State. And that's Pierre Campbell. And Pierre Campbell was the fastest wide receiver drafted this year. Ran a 4.31 40-yard dash, which is very fast, obviously, for a receiver. And the Colts really like him. And it's interesting to me. Pierre Campbell's really interesting to me because I think when you typically think of guys that run really, really fast, you think of a body type like a T.Y. Hilton, a 5'9" guy, kind of smaller guy. But Pierre Campbell is not that at all. In fact, I think he's like 6 foot or 6'1", and he's about 200 pounds. So he's a pretty solid sized wide receiver. And so Pierre Campbell, I think the Colts really like him a lot. I think he might have, while he might be used a little bit like Nyheim Hines and maybe take a few of those snaps away from Nyheim Hines, that is, and maybe play in the slot a little bit, I think he also has the potential, Derek, to eventually, and maybe even this season, be a number 2 wide receiver because he has the height for it. It's not like he's a small guy at all. And so Pierre Campbell is going to be really interesting to watch for the Colts. And I think those are the 3 guys, for me, who I think are kind of locks for this Colts roster. I don't think the Colts would bring in a guy like Devin Funchess, pay him $13 million a year just to cut the guy at training camp. And I don't think they would cut a second-round pick with the talent of Devin Funchess, or Pierre Campbell, I should say. And so those are the 3 guys I think we can talk about. I don't know if you want to talk about Pierre Campbell really fast and kind of what you think he can bring to this Colts offense before we look at the other guys that are potentially fighting it out for that number 4 and potentially number 5 spot.
Yeah, I'll talk real quick about it. I know that, Pierre Campbell definitely has a good body type. That 6'1", 215-pound guy that, is a little bit different than what you said, the normal prototypical speed guy. And that's the thing. His top speed isn't very great, but his acceleration just out the jump is just insane compared to other guys. And it's crazy to think that, he's not really a finished product, to be completely honest. He's more of a guy that has raw potential that we haven't seen tapped into yet. He's never really been the guy to, get covered one-on-one, because the Ohio State did a really good job of putting him in motion a lot of times and making sure he was in different sets. And obviously we saw the routes that he ran where being able to get him out in the open field and let him use his feet is what the Buckeyes wanted him to do. And I'm sure that's what the Colts will do. I'm very interested to see if he actually starts doing a lot more of the cutback routes and other things like that. I'm interested to see what they're able to do. But yeah, you're right. These 3 guys right here are definitely the locks for this Colts roster coming into training camp. And, I think there's one other guy that I would definitely lock up, which we'll talk about here in a second. But apparently there's a lot of other people still have doubts about a bunch of the other receivers we still have on the roster. And sure enough, that's what we're going to be talking about next.
Yeah, one more thing on Pierre Campbell that I wanted to talk about a little bit. Kind of listening to different podcasts, kind of listening to the Colts. When they drafted Pierre Campbell, they're really kind of like, well, no disrespect to Ohio State, but like, how do they not use this guy, deep? How do they not use this guy more? And I think that's one thing that, you talked about how he hasn't really tapped into his potential. I think that one thing that he is working on, and maybe he'll have to work on in his rookie year, is route running. because, like you mentioned, Ohio State put him in motion a lot. They didn't really ask him to go be that burner, even though he had that speed. And so I think the Colts are kind of shocked that Ohio State didn't use him more, and I think they really want to tap into that more with Paris Campbell. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how his game expands and how his route running expands. And so, the next guy we wanted to talk about, I didn't put him on the lock list because I know there are some people who may not consider him a lock because he was injured last year. There's a lot of competition for that number 4 wide receiver spot. But he was a guy last year that really impressed in training camp. The Colts drafted him last year in the 6th round. We're really, I think, shocked that he fell all the way to the 6th round. And he was Clemson's number 1 wide receiver for a couple years when they went to the national championship and actually won. And he's a big-bodied guy, and that's Deon Cain. And Deon Cain is a guy who the Colts are really, really high on. Chris Ballard just talked about today when he was interviewed just about how he's super, super happy for Deon Cain. He's super, super excited for him. He said he's just worked his butt off trying to get back, and he thinks that he's going to have a very successful career in the NFL and with the Colts. And so Deon Cain is a guy who some people may think that, I don't know if he's going to make the roster. He's injured, and we know with Malik Hooker last year coming back from an ACL injury, it takes a while for the players to fully get back to where they were before the injury, and fully trusting their body that it won't happen again. And so it'll be interesting to see how Deon Cain progresses, because he was a guy that was really, Derek, turning heads in training camp. But the Colts were really high on this guy last year. And unfortunately, and I think in the first preseason game against the Seahawks, he tore his ACL, was out for the entire year. But I think the Colts saw him last year. If we were at this time last year, the Colts saw him as potentially the number 2 wide receiver beside T.Y. Hilton. And so it's going to be interesting now to see how Deon Cain comes back and how productive he is. And that's something that we also wanted to talk about, and maybe you can talk about this a little bit, Derek, but about how the Colts don't want to rush guys back, and they want to take it easy on guys, because they talked about how basically the first couple of weeks of camp, especially the first week of camp, players really, get injured, and that's kind of the prime time when players get serious injuries and stuff. And so the Colts are, using those statistics and everything that they, have looked up about their players and about just players in general in the NFL. The word is escaping me right now, but I just thought it would be good to talk about that and kind of how that relates to Deon Cain. And I guess I'll just shut up now and let you talk about Deon Cain.
Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth there, Cody. You're right. He obviously had that gruesome injury. Everybody saw how many heads he was turning in training camp last year before he went down. And you're right, we were talking about players getting injured early in training camp or at the end of minicamp. I think a lot of players try to go much harder when training camp starts, because the eyes are starting to open a lot more because it's closer to the season. You're getting more and more vigorous exercise and all that stuff. And so you start to see these injuries, these freak accidents that happen out of nowhere. And the smart thing that Ballard and Reich are doing is keeping the guys the main key players who, for one, have had off-season surgeries, and the guys who have had some kind of injuries like, Luck, Ebron, Doyle, and a couple of others. They're going to limit them early, and that's not a big deal. They're going to participate, obviously, but they won't be doing the full exercises for roughly about the first couple days, and then after that they'll start to see a lot more time on the field, which is definitely a good thing. And one thing I just find very odd about our fan base is so many people trying to say that Cain shouldn't be a lock or Cain shouldn't really be on the roster to begin with. I'm very interested to find out why. I don't really quite understand it, because anytime I try to find out, nobody really gives me an explanation why, other than, he was injured. Well, I mean, yeah, but Adrian Peterson got injured, had one of the worst ACL injuries we've ever seen, came back 9 months later and had one of the greatest seasons that a running back has ever had. So I'm not comparing Deon Cain to an Adrian Peterson, but that's just an example. And then, everyone says, well, what about all the other receivers on the roster? Well, I mean, I see everybody else say, what about the other receivers on the roster? None of them are locks. Okay, then why can't we put Cain in that conversation? I mean, honestly, he deserved the second chance. We saw the miniseries. Anyone that's watched the Colts Twitter and has seen some of the episodes they've done on Deon Cain and his rehabilitation process, how he's been coping with the injury and everything else. You honestly feel for the guy. You really want to see him come back and do what he did. But why can't Colts fans just hang on to that little glimmer of hope we saw last season? Why can't we give the kid the benefit of the doubt and say, why not go see what this kid can do? I mean, what's the worst? Everyone says Chester Rodgers doesn't really deserve the lock-on spot, but, I think Rodgers is probably our fourth best receiver at the moment until we see what Cain does. And then you got Haskell and Fountain as well, who we'll talk about here soon, I'm sure. But I just ultimately don't see the reason why people are so hesitant to give Cain the benefit of the doubt on this one. I know he hasn't played yet, but then again, we've been giving Campbell so much credit, and yet even the coaches for the Colts have even said, don't expect Campbell's role to be over the top. So why is it we're giving Campbell all this big credit, but we're not going to give Cain the benefit of the doubt in this? Cain's a big body. He's strong. He's athletic. He's certainly not speedy athletic, but he can go up and get the ball. He's basically another Devin Funchess, basically, but he's a little bit smaller. But Cain seems to have the better hands from what I've seen from video and everything else. So for me personally, I know a lot of people don't believe it, but me personally, I think Cain is a lock because not only do I think his physical attributes are there, even if he's like 80% of what he was at the beginning, obviously he's not going to be as good right now because he needs to get back up to speed, back up to confidence with that leg, like you said, Cody. I think that Frank and Chris Ballard have just an emotional side set out for this kid to make sure he gets that second chance because they saw a glimmer of real good in him last season, and I think they can tap into that still. So that's ultimately why I think he's a lock. I don't know what you think. I'm interested to hear your opinion about that.
Yeah, I think that Deon Cain certainly has a shot at this roster. I think he has a leg up on pretty much everybody else right now for the number 4 spot, simply because I think he's a guy that is young. Yes, he got injured last year, and that's unfortunate, but I think he's a young guy, and I think that the Colts see a ton of potential in him. I think he was really turning heads in camp, and I think it would be kind of foolish to say either or right now, just because simply we don't know. We've never seen really Deon Cain. We heard about him, how good he was last year in training camp, and that's all well and good, but honestly, we have no clue how he is when the lights turn on and when they're playing out there on Sundays. We just don't know. So I think it would be foolish to say either way Deon Cain is a lock to make this roster or Deon Cain will not make this roster. I think it's just simply too early, and I think it'll be interesting to see. Deon Cain should be ready, I think, for training camp if I'm right, and it'll be interesting to see. Yes, he'll be eased in a little bit, the Colts have said, but it'll be interesting to see how Deon Cain really comes back from that injury, and the Colts, I know, don't want to rush him back. But I think simply, I'm not going to say one way or the other that I think Deon Cain will make this roster. I definitely think he should make this roster, and I think that all signs point to him making this roster, especially since, even though he was drafted in the 6th round, I think a lot of people were shocked that he fell to the 6th round. I think, even like the year before, if he would have gone out to the draft, I think he might have been a 1st to 2nd round pick if I remember right. So he has the talent, I think, to be a high value, play like a high value pick could. But ultimately, it's all up to the injury. It's all up to how he feels, and it's all up to how he produces. And so it'll be interesting to see. But I think that's just kind of my opinion. It's kind of my opinion that I don't have an opinion here because I just don't know. And I'm not educated enough to know that. I'm not in there every day with Deon Cain, seeing how he's progressing. I wasn't at training camp last year to see how much he was turning heads. Yes, we can hear about it. Yes, the Colts can rave about him. But we just don't know. And that's kind of where I stand right now with the whole Deon Cain situation. Okay, so there's a lot of other players here that are going to be vying for probably that number 4, number 5 spot. You got a guy last year who I think he was second on interceptions last year with the Colts, and that's Chester Rodgers. He's been around for a long time. He was undrafted a few years ago out of Grambling State. He's been around. He's shown flashes for sure, but he's also shown a lot of inconsistencies. I think he was one of the leading droppers last year for the Colts. I think he had like 10 drops or something like that for the Colts last year. And so Chester Rodgers, I think, ultimately, Derek, I think what can potentially keep Chester Rodgers on this roster is his punt and kick return ability. And he did that, I know, last year for the Colts, and he was very valuable to them because he was pretty good at it. And I think, unless the Colts find somebody who is as good or better than him at returning punts, I don't see him going off of this roster. But ultimately, there could be somebody that emerges. You never really know, I guess, but right now, I think that kind of gives him a leg up on the other guys on this list, and we'll get to them in a minute. But I wanted to get your thoughts on Chester Rodgers and his potential to make this roster for the Colts in 2019.
Yeah, as many people say they don't like him being on the roster, I don't really see a lot of options that point to him not being on this roster. I totally think he's going to be that wide receiver 4 or 5, doesn't get many snaps, but I mean, you said it. His drops are really bad. Obviously, we know that he had a lot of drops over the span of his career. There's no denying it. But, I mean, people kind of forget just how many times that Andrew Luck did have to rely on him last year. He did make that great catch in the Miami game that helped put the Indianapolis Colts in position to get the game-winning field goal. And he had many spectacular catches against the Patriots when they played. I mean, this guy can play. I know that, obviously the drops are a big issue, and that's what's going to put him at the bottom of the roster. I totally understand it, and as much as I wish he would just stop dropping the ball, I understand, but I do think that he has enough intangibles to be able to just say, I'm good enough to be on this roster. And like you mentioned, he can return punts. I wouldn't be surprised to see Paris Campbell possibly be in that role at some point. Paris Campbell could possibly return kick returns as well. Obviously, we know with that speed. But you're right. Chester Rodgers' ability to play special teams does give him that edge to put him there. Even if he doesn't play that much, he still is that special teams guy and a guy they can throw out there at any given moment if they need the wide receiver depth. And as last I checked, 3 receivers certainly isn't enough to compete in the NFL with. And, many people are right about Deon Cain taking a while to get back. I'm certainly not taking my chances on a couple of these other receivers on this roster. So I do ultimately think, Chester Rodgers in a limited role will be on this roster for the Indianapolis Colts, pending something happens, we get somebody, or, he happens to get injured. I don't know, but I do expect him to be on this roster come week 1.
Yeah, I have a few more thoughts on Rodgers. I think first off, you talked about just the rapport he has with Luck, and I think that's pretty valuable. I think that's a factor that a lot of people haven't considered. Is he's worked with Andrew Luck now for, I guess, 2 years, because Andrew Luck didn't play in 2017. But so he's had 2 years with Andrew Luck, more than most receivers outside of T.Y. Hilton. The most out of any receiver outside of T.Y. Hilton, actually. And so I think that's a big thing. And he had his best year, even though he did have those drops, and those were an issue. And I think another thing, Derek, with the wide receiver, that number 4, number 5 wide receiver position, it's like those guys aren't going to be seeing snaps. Like Chester Rodgers, whether or not he makes this roster in 2019, he won't be seeing nearly as many snaps as he did last year, because the Colts have a lot more talent, and I think they have a lot more potentially established talent than they did in 2018, which kind of forced Rodgers to be more on the field. And so. And another thing, it's kind of like we're going to talk about another position, the cornerbacks, in a little bit. But, with those guys, like, you got to do something to make this roster in the NFL. You can't just be, a pretty good receiver, but you have to play special teams in order to make this roster, is what I'm trying to say. And Chester Rodgers has shown that he can do that, and he has versatility in that. And I think that ultimately will keep him on this roster because, as awesome as it would be to have a guy like Paris Campbell returning kicks, we saw it last year with Nyheim Hines, where you don't want to put too much on the plate of a rookie coming in, because Nyheim Hines, we saw in the preseason, he really struggled last year when he had to be a running back, yes, a receiving threat, yes, which he was. He ultimately showed in 2018. But when it came to throwing another thing on his plate of returning kicks, it simply was just too much for him as a rookie. And Nyheim Hines is a very smart guy. It's not like he couldn't do it. It's just it was a lot to throw in a rookie. And so that's why I think Chester Rodgers, for me, has a little bit of a leg up on these other guys we'll talk about in a second, simply because he can do multiple things for you. And it remains to be seen whether there's other guys who can do that, whether it's whoever it is, I guess. So it'll be interesting to see Chester Rodgers, and I think that's why, for me, he makes this roster for the Colts in 2019. Okay, so a couple more guys that could potentially make this roster that we saw was a guy last year who the Colts actually traded for near the end of the preseason, I believe. They traded one of their tight ends, Darrell Daniels, for him to the Philadelphia Eagles, and they got him last year, and he actually played pretty well when given snaps. I think he got injured in that New York Jets game, but that was kind of the game he broke out, and then he got injured, and the Colts, and he has good size and stuff. It'll be interesting to see what he can potentially bring to the Colts, and maybe he can sneak on this roster, who knows. But this guy is Marcus Johnson, who is a guy I think who could be a sneaky good player for the Colts if he does indeed make this roster, because he showed flashes. He's still very a young player, and it'll be interesting to see whether or not he makes this roster in 2019.
Yeah, I mean, the sample size for Marcus Johnson is just a little bit too small to really kind of tell. And there's a couple of other guys that you can think of that could be in that spot, for that position. But yeah, you're right. Marcus Johnson had a couple of catches that just kind of shock you when you see it. He had a couple of plays in the red zone towards the end of the year when the Colts absolutely needed the wide receiver depth. They had to scrape all the way down to the bottom of the barrel for him. And, I mean, he did deliver when he was in. He didn't really get a whole lot of opportunities to catch, but at the times that he did, he certainly wasn't the least efficient wide receiver for the Colts. So that will be an interesting pick for Frank Reich, because there's a couple of other guys that I would rank ahead of Marcus Johnson, but sure enough, you're right. If he decides to get an expanded role, then it'll be interesting to see how he fares at the bottom of this rotation for the wide receiver group.
And you also throw in he was with Frank Reich when he was with the Eagles, and so Frank Reich has that connection with him as well. So it'll be interesting to see what he does, if he does anything for the Colts, and how the position plays out in training camp. Okay, another guy who was an undrafted free agent that the Colts signed last year, it was Zack Paschal, and he was a guy who I think he showed flashes for the Colts. I always remember that game against Houston where he had that fade route and just completely obliterated the Texans defensive back, and kind of showed that he has flashes. He's kind of a bigger body as well, and so it'll be interesting to see if Zack Paschal can take the leap in year 2, Derek.
Yeah, and the funny thing is as much as I don't like to listen to PFF that much, because PFF has their own analytics way of doing things, one thing they usually don't get wrong is percentages, because percentages of how many things you catch, certainly you can't mess that up unless you got the numbers completely wrong. He was actually the least efficient wide receiver for the Colts last year, which definitely doesn't help his case for this upcoming year. But you're right, he definitely has flashes just like the rest of these guys. Everyone remembers the play where he absolutely shredded the Texans secondary and caught that pass by Andrew. Certainly was the highlight of the year. It was one of the best plays for the Colts that year. So that definitely does help him. Paschal is probably right now is my number 6 or 7 receiver at this point. But you're right. He definitely is one of the bigger names that a lot of people have been bringing up as to whether or not he will make the rotation.
All right, another guy that the Colts drafted last year, he was actually put on the NFL list just recently by the Colts, is Darius Fountain, or Reese, as he likes to be called. And Reese really didn't play a whole lot for the Colts in 2018. I think he was on the practice squad for most of the year, and then he was activated and didn't really do a whole lot. But he's a guy that I know that has been putting in work, and so he could potentially, challenge for a roster spot, I guess. And so what did you see from Reese Fountain that could potentially make him find a way on this roster with training camp?
Yeah, when I see Reese Fountain, I kind of think of a lot of a less athletic Deion Kane. One of those guys that is big, he's strong, he's got good hands. He had a great catch rate in college. That's definitely something. He's a possession guy. He loves to take the hits. He's not afraid of the contact, which I definitely think the Colts can find use for. He just ultimately doesn't have that. He doesn't have that speed that a lot of people need to get separation from their corners. And so he'd be great against zone coverages, no question. But if we're going man on man, unless you're in the red zone and allow him to go up and get it, then he's really not any use for you. But when in the right system, if you play him in the right coverages, specifically in zone, or if you're in the red zone and you're trying to make a play over the head, Reese Fountain is definitely your guy. We'll have to see if he gets the role during training camp, what he does with it. But I definitely think he might be that last guy that I think can squeeze into the roster for week 1.
Okay, and there's a couple more guys that I'm just going to kind of all clump into one thing, and we can do quick fire, talk about them for a few minutes. So I'll start first with Steve Ishmael, a guy that was an undrafted free agent last year. Hasn't really done a whole lot, but I know there's some Steve Ishmael fans out there. And so I think he actually went to the same college as Marvin Harrison, if I'm thinking correctly here. So he's a guy that could potentially challenge for something. We'll see. Krishan Hogan is a guy that's been around for the Colts for a couple years, and I know he's shown a little bit of flashes, but he's also been injured. Then you got a guy like Ashton Doolin, who was a guy who came in this year, undrafted free agent who could potentially show some stuff as well. And so I'm not sure if you kind of want to talk about these guys really fast. And also Penny Hart is another guy that I want to talk about as well. Another guy that was drafted, undrafted free agent that was brought in by the Colts this year. So do you think any of these guys, Derek, could potentially challenge for that number 4, number 5 wide receiver spot, and why?
I think if any of these guys are definitely going to, I think it is Penny Hart. Just with his speed and just with the natural route running talent that this guy has, I definitely think he is one of the guys that could potentially reach him with that roster spot. Obviously, these guys are at the bottom of the barrel for a reason. They help our practice squad out. They will have their chance, I'm sure. But yeah, if I had to put my money on one of them, I'd definitely go with Penny Hart to possibly make the roster. All right, and now we're going to move on to the linebacker group, one of my favorite spots for this year. And obviously, the first person we got to talk about is obvious Darius Leonard. And obviously, there's a lot to talk about with Darius Leonard. And one thing, Cody, that really stuck out with me is what he said, I think a few days ago, where he said he was asked about, all the other guys and where he fits on the roster and everything else, just kind of what he was expecting. And he says, I am actually just trying to make sure I make the roster. See, now that is a classic Darius Leonard answer right there, because the guy is so humble. The guy knows that just because I had one of the best seasons for a linebacker all time does not give me the right to say that I am the guy now and I have to. And I'm just given it now. I have to earn my spot. I have to keep my spot. I have to be the guy in order to claim my status as the guy on defense. I just absolutely love what Darius Leonard has said, and I'm glad he's going to be the man of this defense for sure. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about with Darius Leonard. Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit of what you're thinking with Darius Leonard's comments and what you expect for him come training camp?
Yeah, definitely. Well, man, it's so good to have a guy like Darius Leonard leading the charge for the Colts linebackers. A guy that we've talked about who had a historic 2018 season. I mean, made all pro. Him and Quentin Nelson were the first pair to do it, I think, since something like 1970. So over 30, 40 years. And so it's good that a guy like Darius Leonard, even though he had a year like he had, he's still not satisfied. Like, he's like, well, I didn't make the Pro Bowl. We didn't win the Super Bowl. I wasn't the MVP. And to see a guy like that setting the example and saying, making comments like that, where it's just like, well, I have to make sure my spot's safe. It's like, ultimately, that saying that they say where it's like actions speak louder than words. And Darius Leonard, I think he has said his words of like where he thinks he should be and where he wants to be. But it's cool to see a guy that doesn't just talk the talk, but also is prepared to walk the walk. And it's got to be good for the guys that the Colts have brought in, this year, the young guys, to just see a young guy like Darius Leonard, who just had this historic season, who is consistently wanting to get better. And I think that if I was a player on the Colts defense, if I was a Colts linebacker, that would inspire me to want to be the best I can be, because it's like, well, Darius Leonard did fantastic and that wasn't good enough. Right? It's never going to be good enough. We're always striving, like Frank Reich and the Colts say, striving to get 1% better every day. And to have a guy who firmly believes in that, and even though he had a fantastic season, it wasn't good enough for him. And he's always striving to be better. And that is the kind of leader that the Colts want on their defense, a guy that will lead by example. And so it's very, very amazing, I think, that the Colts found a guy like that, a Darius Leonard, who is so humble. He obviously is a guy who wants the awards and he wants to be recognized as the best linebacker in the league, but he's also a very humble guy. He'll give credit to his teammates. Like he always gives credit to Anthony Walker all the time, saying like, if Anthony Walker wasn't here, like I wouldn't have had the success that I had. And that is just a great thing to have from a guy like him, where it's like he's motivated, yes, but he's also very humble. And so the Colts should feel, I think, very lucky to have a guy like Darius Leonard, who is now entering his second NFL season, and it can only get better from here, honestly.
Yep, you pretty much gave the reason why the Colts fell in love with this guy. Just to have a leader that's humble as humble as he is, just to be able to say that and actually mean it. Obviously, we as Colts fans know he's going to go out there every day and work his butt off, and obviously he's going to be the number one guy. But to have him firmly say that and mean that he truly wants to earn his spot definitely makes us feel so much better, knowing he's going to be leading our defense for the next 10 years or so. And we're going to talk about the next guy that you brought up, who Darius Leonard is very fond of, and that's Anthony Walker. Now, last season, many people may not know this, but Anthony Walker silently had one of the best seasons of a linebacker last year. I think it was over 100 tackles. He's one of only 3 guys that had 100 tackles and 5 sacks, and it was some other stat. I can't remember exactly, but it was Darius Leonard, Luke Kuechly, and then it was Anthony Walker, which is crazy to me because so many people keep talking down on this man. And I don't know why, because Anthony Walker had a really, really good season last year. There were obviously times where he was out of place at certain points. Obviously, he's not as good as reading the gaps as Darius Leonard. He's not as athletic as Darius Leonard is. But certainly, Anthony Walker has earned his spot on this roster for sure. And I can't wait to see personally what Anthony Walker can do this next year, because I would love to see him take an even bigger leap. And if he actually can do that, that's going to be absolutely crazy to see with him and Darius Leonard, the dynamic duo that they already are.
Yeah, I just pulled up the stat here. So 3 linebackers in the NFL last season tallied 105 tackles, 10 tackles for loss, 1 sack, and 1 interception. And those players were Darius Leonard, Luke Kuechly, and Anthony Walker. And so I think it tells you right there that tells the story of how good Walker was in 2018, and I think he quietly was overshadowed by just the amazing year, obviously, that Darius Leonard had. But yeah, you got a guy like Anthony Walker, who I think is the captain of this defense. I mean, he was a captain in college, and now he's the captain of this Colts defense. And you even saw it in that New York Giants game when Anthony Walker was out. The Colts looked confused. Their defense really looked confused, and they allowed Eli Manning to shred them. Which I firmly believe that if Anthony Walker was in there, making sure everybody's in position, that wouldn't have happened, and the Colts probably would have blown out the Giants, honestly. And so Anthony Walker is very valuable to this Colts defense, as we've said. And I think that the Colts really found a diamond in the rough when they drafted Walker in the 5th round of the 2017 draft. And I think Walker just showed a lot of things to the Colts. So, going in last year to training camp, I think there was a lot of questions in these Colts linebackers, like who in the world is going to be. We knew that Darius Leonard was probably going to be a starter day one, but like we didn't know he was obviously going to have the season he had, and two, we didn't know who was going to play that Mike position. And Anthony Walker came in and just had a really, really solid season for the Colts, and it's going to be good, I think, to see now Anthony Walker now that he has a lot of confidence. And it'll just be good to see how he grows in this defense now in year two of Matt Eberflus's system, to see how he grows and see how he can become the best player that he can become. And so I think absolutely I agree with you. He deserves a spot on this roster. And honestly, I think he deserves a starting spot on this Colts defense in 2019.
Yeah, he's a very smart guy. And obviously he's that middle linebacker. He's going to see things that even Darius Leonard sometimes doesn't see. That's why he's so important. And that's why Darius Leonard continues to give him so much credit for allowing the Colts defense to be in the right position. You're right. There's so many questions about Anthony Walker as if he was actually going to be able to, do anything for this Colts defense. Many didn't know if he'd actually get a lot of playing time when he first came here. And, just to being able to do what he did, he could have another season like he did last year. And I think most Colts fans would take that. I firmly believe it. And now we're going to talk about a guy who a lot of people have been saying might end up taking some time away from Anthony Walker. And it's Bobby Okereke, obviously the linebacker from Stanford who was drafted in the third round of the 2018 draft this year for the Colts. Bobby Okereke is an interesting pick for me because from what I've read about him, he's obviously very smart. He's a slightly undersized linebacker, but that was kind of what the knock was on Darius Leonard. But there's a lot of physical attributes that are very similar to Darius Leonard with that undersized, but he's got very long arms. He can play outside and inside of the tackle box as he played both in college. So I think that it would be very interesting to see him as the other outside linebacker. That's my ideal spot that I'd like to see him. I don't know where the Colts are thinking. I'm going to guess that they probably will put him on outside linebacker because I don't know if they want to take Anthony Walker away from that because obviously Anthony Walker is pretty set where he is. But if Bobby Okereke can, be what the great Pat McAfee said about him on draft day, being the future Hall of Famer that he is, it would definitely be awesome to see Okereke alongside of Darius Leonard and Anthony Walker and see what he can do this season.
Yeah, my only question is, what will that Colts Sam linebacker position look like? We saw it last year with guys we'll talk about in a little bit with Matthew Adams and Zaire Franklin, both kind of sharing time there. But really, that last year, that Sam linebacker position really wasn't on the field a whole lot. I don't know, I don't have the stat right in front of me, but I know it was a small percentage that Sam linebacker actually saw the field. And so that would be my only question is how do the Colts plan to use that Sam linebacker? And also, when they do use that Sam linebacker, if they do use it the same way they used it last year, like, does he even fit that mold to what they're looking for? Or do they continue to believe in guys like Matthew Adams or Zaire Franklin or even E.J. Speed, a guy that we'll talk about in a second. And so those are my questions. But I think Bobby Okereke is definitely good. I think a lot of people maybe have thought, oh, will he take Anthony Walker's spot away? Which I think it'll be a competition, but ultimately I think the spot is Walker's to lose. And I think Walker will ultimately end up keeping it. And so it's good. Bobby Okereke is a good player for the Colts. They knew that. They drafted him, third round, so pretty high. And I think he just is something. It's just good, I think, for the Colts linebackers because last year, heck, you saw it when Anthony Walker went down a couple games. When Darius Leonard was down, like the Colts linebackers, they didn't have anybody. I mean, really, they had some seventh-round picks. And who else did they really have? They didn't have depth last year at the linebacker position. So adding a guy like Okereke, say Anthony Walker misses a game or Darius Leonard misses a game, he can step into that role, and the drop-off isn't as huge as it was maybe in 2018. And so, I think that Bobby Okereke is certainly a very good player. It'll be interesting to see what his role is, whether it's just spot duty behind Anthony Walker and Darius Leonard or whether he actually has a starting spot for the Colts in 2019. And so, I'm excited to see what Okereke brings to this Colts defense and kind of how it'll be interesting to see over the next couple weeks where the Colts line him up on their defense.
And another guy that we're going to be talking about here is E.J. Speed. Obviously was drafted in the 5th round by the Colts this year. A couple knocks on him was that, he obviously came from a small school. Now, that's not uncommon. We do see that a lot in a lot of other players, but not very often do those guys immediately come out of college and then make an immediate impact. Not to say that E.J. Speed can't do that at some point, but obviously he's got some competition ahead of him. A couple other knocks is, he's not your prototypical linebacker as well. He's a little bit more undersized, kind of like Okereke and Darius Leonard. But the one great thing about E.J. Speed is the athleticism of this man is absolutely insane. He kind of lives up to his last name. He is quick, he is fast, he is agile, he's got long arms, and he's just a more athletic Darius Leonard. He was actually compared to that at the Combine. Obviously, he struggles in zone coverage a lot. He's more of a rusher due to his speed and being able to cover all ends of the field, getting from one end to the other and being able to disrupt plays in the backfield. That's ultimately what he brings to the table. My big thing is I would love to see him play on the special teams a little bit, get some more experience there as well. As like you said, Chester Rodgers obviously has his abilities where he can play the offense, but he's also the special return guy. I think E.J. Speed can definitely be a middle of the pack kind of guy who can block, guy who's fast, guy can help create blocks and create other small opportunities for the Indianapolis Colts. I am interested to see where he goes. I don't know how much playing time he'll get this year. Pending injury, E.J. Speed could definitely be a guy that we could see sometime. Even the Colts have said that, he's not quite the finished product yet. They have a lot of things that they want to do to work with him before he's ready to play. But if he can learn under Eberflus and can learn to play in the pass coverage, I could just imagine how quick and how good this linebacker core could be if they have a Darius Leonard and an E.J. Speed on the outsides, and then having an Anthony Walker and a Bobby Okereke in the middle. That just makes me so happy to think if all these guys eventually come to terms with what they can be, my goodness, this linebacker core for the Colts is going to be one of the best in the NFL.
Yeah, and another thing you talked about with Speed, how he's very athletic, very fast. He's also very tall. He's 6'4", and so he's a very big person, the long arms. And, ultimately, you talked about it. If he can live up to expectations, man, there's no telling. The sky's the limit for this guy because he's got all the physical tools. He's actually, interesting enough, a little background info about Speed. So he arrived in Tarleton State in 2013. He's actually was a converted wide receiver, and then he redshirted. And so this guy was a wide receiver at one point, so he's got the speed for it. And so it'd be interesting, to see how E.J. Speed. I think, maybe this is a bad comparison and may leave a bad taste in some Colts fans' mouths. Is I think a guy that he really kind of reminds me of when the Colts drafted and kind of Chris Ballard's philosophy is a guy like Zack Banner. And I know Zack Banner didn't work out, so Colts fans hear me out here. But the Colts drafted, I think, Zack Banner in 2017 in the 4th round because he had such amazing physical tools. Say what you want about him. He wasn't tough enough. He wasn't good enough to make the Colts roster. But that guy was massive. Zack Banner was a massive player. And I think the same way E.J. Speed has all the physical tools to be a very good player in this league. And in the 5th round, you can kind of take a chance on a guy like that, a small school guy with all the physical tools. And ultimately, you've talked about it, the Colts have talked about it. They don't think he's ready to see the field probably anytime soon because he's coming. He's still trying to make that giant leap from Tarleton State to the NFL. It's a large leap to make. And so it'll be interesting, though, because E.J. Speed does have all the tools, and ultimately it is up to him. But I think it'll be interesting to see, say 1, 2, 3, 4 years, if a guy like E.J. Speed, is coached up well, and really figures out what he can do in the NFL, how good this Colts linebacking core could be, even if E.J. Speed's not starting, but he's just in the rotation of the Colts linebackers, and he's a good player for the Colts. It'll be intriguing, Derek, to see E.J. Speed and kind of how he develops and what his role really is. Because I agree with you. I think he probably will have to play special teams to make this roster, work his way up the roster a little bit, if you will, until he can, is a fully more polished linebacker in the NFL and kind of figures out what that looks like in this Colts defense. And so, E.J. Speed's a very interesting player for me as well. That's definitely a player I want to keep an eye on over the next couple of years.
And lastly, we kind of talk a little bit about some of the other players that the Colts have drafted. Matthew Adams, who was drafted in the 7th round of 2018. Zehra Franklin as well, who's drafted in the 2018 draft as well late. And Skye Moore, who is an undrafted free agent, who we brought along board as well. These are some guys who, again, are not very polished linebackers, but are guys that, have the athletic traits that Chris Ballard and Frank Reich are looking for to try and fit into that system. Is there anybody here of those three, Cody, that you think could possibly sneak their way into the roster?
Well, this one's hard for me because I think all three of these guys have some potential to make this roster. But I got to go with what I've seen based on the sample size that I've seen it. I'd probably have to go with Matthew Adams just because, he played that Sam linebacker position for the Colts. He didn't start at the beginning of the year as a Sam linebacker, but eventually he did kind of earn that starting spot at the Sam linebacker position. And I thought he played pretty well for the Colts. And I think he's a good run stopper, and that's kind of what the Colts need in their defense. And so I think if I had to choose one, I'd probably go Matthew Adams simply because I think he played pretty well when asked to do certain things, and I think that he could make the roster simply, on those rundowns to kind of help the Colts, in their tremendous run defense last year, and hopefully bringing that over into 2019. So probably Matthew Adams. It's kind of a coin flip for me, but I'd probably go with Adams based off of what I've seen. All right, and the last position group that we wanted to look at was the Colts corners. You knew this was coming. I've said this multiple times on this podcast. This is the most intriguing position for me to watch because there's so much talent on this Colts cornerback group. And so I thought that we should probably start with the four guys that we know will probably be locks to make this roster. It'll be intriguing to see because there's a lot of guys vying for that number 5 position and potentially, who knows, maybe that number 6 position. So we'll start with the two starters from last year, two guys who earned new contract extensions, actually. And we'll start with the guy who was a number 1 corner last year, Pierre Desir.
Yeah, Pierre Desir, what more can you talk about with this guy? Just being able to, block down players like DeAndre Hopkins. People kind of brush over that, and we saw that in the recent Madden ratings, too. He's a 99, and apparently Pierre Desir is a pretty decent cornerback if he can shut down a 99 overall wide receiver. So apparently that's a pretty good feat for him. But, yeah, we've talked about him recently about how, he fits the Chris Ballard, Frank Reich kind of system, taller, athletic guy that can tumble at the line of scrimmage and can go up and get the football whenever he chooses to. Pierre is definitely fast. He's got great agility. I mean, this is a guy that definitely is one of the best at what he does. Obviously doesn't get as much credit as Kenny Moore when it comes to, Kenny Moore being the slot corner and most likely being the top slot corner, if not the second. But Pierre Desir definitely is a very silent, good cornerback that a lot of the national media doesn't quite realize until they actually look at the numbers and, see that this guy just locks down most of the receivers that he comes up with. And to do it against DeAndre Hopkins twice a year, that's impressive in enough of itself. Many view DeAndre Hopkins as the best wide receiver in the game at the moment. I expect another good year from Pierre Desir. Now that he's gotten paid, he knows that his position on this Colts roster is second to none at this point. He knows what he's got to do to keep that momentum up, and I can't wait to see what this guy can do since, again, he's also so young.
Yeah, and another thing that I think is interesting, so typically when you think of cornerbacks, you don't think of guys who can tackle or are very great at tackling. But an interesting stat that I wanted to look at really fast. And again, Pro Football Focus, take it what you will. But this was a very interesting stat to me. So this stat was the most tackle opportunities per missed tackle. And it was a minimum of 75 tackle opportunities. And Pierre Desir was the only cornerback on this list. So you guys got guys like Damon Harrison, who's one of the best players in the league. Bobby Wagner, probably the best linebacker in the league. Devondre Campbell, I don't even really know who that is. And then you got Pierre Desir. He's even ahead of guys like Avery Williamson, who's a pretty good linebacker. So he's a guy who can also tackle. And I think that's a big thing for the Colts, is they want their corners to be guys who are willing tacklers and coming up. And so you can talk all day about how good he is in coverage, but also he's a fearless tackler, and he's a great leader for the Colts. And, the Colts ultimately decided with him and Kenny Moore, who we'll talk about in a second, that, when guys ball out and when guys play well, they're going to get paid. And so I think Pierre Desir now knows that his value to the Colts. And Pierre Desir he's one of the nicest guys, I think, that I've seen in a while. And I think that he's young, relatively young, 27, 28 years old. And so he's got a good, I think he can potentially play out his contract and maybe even earn another small contract with the Colts, depending on how his play is. But, based off of how he played in 2018, I think the Colts are set at the number one corner for a while there. And so the next guy we want to look at is the other guy we just mentioned, Kenny Moore, who is a guy that was interesting enough. Him and Pierre Desir were actually claimed on the same day. Both guys, Kenny Moore was an undrafted free agent, and Pierre Desir was, I think, a fourth-round pick with the Seahawks a few years ago. But Kenny Moore was a guy that was undrafted free agent back in the Colts 2017 season. He didn't see a whole lot of the field in 2017, I remember, but it's kind of a fun fact. So I remember there's a lot of injuries to the Colts corners that year, and Kenny Moore got the chance to start, I believe, in the Thursday night game, an awful game, just god-awful game against the Broncos. I was actually able to go to that game, and we got really good seats because who wants to be there watching a terrible Colts team and a terrible Broncos team? But I was able to go there, and Kenny Moore actually got his first career interception there. And so that's kind of a fun thing I always will remember. But now, looking at it, he had an incredible 2018 season. He really just ascended to new heights, and I think he just exceeded all expectations that anybody had on him. And he's a very effective blitzer as well. I mean, we saw it at the end of the year. He was coming on those corner blitzes, and he could not be stopped. He would not be denied his sacks. And so Kenny Moore is a player who, he's a good slot corner, he's probably one of the best in the league, honestly, number one or number two, like you mentioned, Derek. But also he can play the outside corner. He's a guy that can, while he's, I think, 5'9", 5'10", so he's not a tall corner. He's a pretty small corner. The thing that's interesting about him is he's got very long arms. So he's got long arms like a taller cornerback would have, but even though he's smaller, he plays a lot bigger than he is. And so Kenny Moore, well-earned extension as well. I'm definitely excited to see how Kenny Moore continues to ascend in this Colts defense with all the different ways that they're going to use him. And I guess, Derek, what are your thoughts on Kenny?
Well, first thing, I feel like if I had a nickel for every time you and I have said either undersized, speed, or long arms, could probably get some good revenue going in this podcast right here. But anyway, back to Kenny Moore. You're right. He's definitely the guy that's going to be the most intriguing. Obviously got paid this offseason, highest paid slot corner in the NFL. And I think one thing you mentioned that Pierre Desir does really well, tackling. I think Kenny Moore is that guy that definitely is great in the disguised coverages. When they bring him off the outside on blitzes, he certainly doesn't miss when he gets the chance to tackle somebody. That's one great thing about him. And that's certainly a skill that we're going to be talking about with another guy that we're going to be bringing up here soon. Kenny Moore is just a guy that, many didn't have any faith in him until he actually got on the field and he started performing. As undersized as he is, I mean, the kid just sticks around and he knows exactly where he needs to be when he plays. So I can't complain at all about Kenny Moore. I mean, I've said it before many months back, and I'll say it again, that this Colts secondary and the corners especially are becoming, some of the most under-talked about corners in the league for as good as they are. They just don't produce the headlines and they don't produce as many stats as some other corners do, but collectively as a unit, these two just do so well, and they complement each other so well because they're so comparable with each other than their size. So again, yeah, I can't wait to see what Kenny Moore does. I look for him to have another productive season. I hope he can get some more interceptions this year, even though he had a bunch at the end of the year. I'd like to see that interception number actually go up, because I truly think that with the pressure being put on the quarterback this year, because there's going to be a lot more of it, I think that it might force the quarterbacks to make some more bad throws out there in the secondary, and I look for Kenny Moore to possibly be that guy to intercept some more passes.
Okay, the next guy that we're going to talk about on our list was a guy who started at the slot corner last year for the Colts, former second-round pick. The Colts drafted him in 2017 alongside with Malik Hooker, and he's kind of had an up and down first couple years. I think by the end of the year, he really was playing at a very high level for the Colts. And the guy that Chris Ballard has really raved on is Quincy Wilson.
Yeah, Quincy is definitely a guy that's a very interesting pick, and it will continue to be another hot topic on whether or not he what kind of time he gets with, obviously we have our two guys where we want them, and then Rocky Sin coming in. We're going to talk about him in a minute. But, yeah, and I think one thing you kind of knocked with Rodgers and a couple other guys from the wide receiver group, you knocked on the consistency. And I think that's just kind of been the thing that he's pretty much just been missing for the majority of his career. And I think that's kind of messed with his confidence. I think everybody kind of expected Quincy to come in right away and be that guy and then, lead this team to where it is. And then Kenny Moore and Pierre Desir take over those spots. And Quincy kind of feels, I don't know if he necessarily felt left out or if he felt that he wasn't living up to his own expectations. But certainly I think now with as much competition as there is now between these cornerbacks, I think Quincy is finally going to get, that reality check and know that if he wants to play, he's going to have to compete real hard for his spot, because here comes Rocky Sin and a couple of other guys. So I do think Quincy is better than a lot of people give him credit for. I think he's got good size. He's really good in coverage. I think he's exceptionally fast, even though his 40 time is not great. I think that his ability to keep with the receivers was great. I do expect this to be a season where you see a little bit more of Quincy Wilson than we have in years past.
One thing that I just noted was, it's kind of crazy to me, but Quincy Wilson is actually younger than Rock Ya-Sin. So that means when Quincy Wilson was drafted, he was 20 years old. Very young, drafted very young, and Chris Ballard's even admitted it. I remember him saying, it's not Quincy's fault that we drafted him so young. He's had immaturity issues. He's had consistency issues. Obviously, for whatever reason, Chuck Pagano and his staff did not like Quincy Wilson for whatever reason. It seemed like he barely saw the field in 2017, which as a 20-year-old kid, that's got to shake your confidence a little bit. I mean, if you're like, well, why did I get drafted so early if I'm not even going to freaking play the whole year? And so I can definitely see that. And, just this year, the way this year went at the beginning for Quincy Wilson, you kind of look at even starting at the beginning of the year, he got a little bit torched in that Bengal game in week 1. And, for a guy that, has the potential to be the Colts' number one corner, I remember in the offseason, somebody wrote a column saying the Colts are searching for that number one corner, and Quincy Wilson got on Twitter and actually said, well, they found it, basically talking about himself. And then, to come in and just kind of have a rough start to 2018, that probably shook his confidence a little bit. But fortunately, the Colts brought in Mike Mitchell, who really was the savior for Quincy Wilson, in terms of his just playing and consistency and how to be a pro. And so I think that now a lot of those immaturity issues hopefully have subsided for Quincy Wilson. He definitely seems like he's in the best place he's been as far as maturity goes and just as a player in the NFL. So yeah, it'll be interesting, Derek. I would agree with you. It'll be interesting to see how now Quincy Wilson entering year 3, what he does off of this strong end to his 2018 season. Okay, so with that, the guy that we just mentioned, the guy the Colts drafted this year with their first pick in the second round, is Rock Ya-Sin. And Rock Ya-Sin is a player who, out of Temple, I think he actually came in as a freshman. And one of the things that they do at Temple is like the players that get the low numbers, I think, are the toughest players on the team. That's kind of how a Temple does it. Is how they kind of assign numbers. And as a freshman, I think he was one of the only freshmen that ever did it at Temple. As a freshman, he came in and he had a single-digit number. And so that just kind of talks about Rock Ya-Sin's toughness. He's a former wrestler, so I don't think tackling will be an issue for him. He's obviously a very tough player as well. Seems to be a very disciplined player. Seems to just be all business for the Colts, which is great. And I think one training camp battle that'll be interesting to watch, Derek, is that number 3 position with Quincy Wilson and Rock Ya-Sin. Like, who is going to take that number 3 position? And so it'll be interesting to see. And I guess, what do you think? This is my question for you, Derek. What do you think each player has to do to earn that number 3 position and basically be a starter for the Colts in 2019?
Well, what we do know about Quincy is his inconsistencies has just been that what I mentioned earlier. Sometimes he just looks as if he's out of place sometimes in the coverages. I know sometimes he loses himself in zone coverage. I think that would be the ultimate thing that he would need to improve upon in order to keep that where he needs to be. And Rock Ya-Sin, in order to get a spot for him, he really needs to accept what God has given him and what his attributes are. And that is being able to tackle, being aggressive at the line of scrimmage with his guys. Because obviously Quincy Wilson is a lot more athletic than Rock Ya-Sin. I think Quincy is the guy that can definitely cover down the field a lot better than Rock Ya-Sin. So it's going to be an issue for Rock if he's going to end up trying to compete for that job, because he knows he's not going to be as athletic, but what he has to make up in athleticness is his toughness, and that certainly isn't an issue because you mentioned it. He was a former high school all-state wrestler. A guy knows how to grapple people. He knows how to be aggressive, and that's just his nature. And I think one thing that we also don't mention a lot is Rock Ya-Sin needs to also show the coaches his effort, not just on the field, but off the field. Because we have heard several times about how he is always there every day. He's almost always the first one of the cornerback group. He's almost always there first. He's always wanting to stay longer, do more, be there early, learn more. And that is exactly what gets you to where you want to be if you're wanting to impress the coaches. If you show not just the effort on the field, but if you show the effort off the field, and he can do that more than Quincy, then that definitely will give him the better option. So Quincy, in order to get the spot, he's definitely going to need to capitalize on better zone coverage reads and show more effort off the field. And Rock Ya-Sin, he has all the tools he needs. He just has to continue to do them even more, and then that will get him a lot more playing time this year for the Colts. And ultimately, that's where I think both of those guys lie at.
Yeah, so those are our 4 guys that we think are probably going to be locks for this Colts cornerback roster in 2019. And so one guy that I thought I could just throw in here really fast since he's a draft pick is Marvell Tell, a guy that was drafted by the Colts this year. He's a former safety. The Colts wanted to convert him to corner and see how that works. So what do you see from Tell, Derek, that could potentially make him have a spot on this Colts cornerback roster?
Well, I kind of see, again, the prototype of the corner that they like. He's taller. He's got good speed. He's got good awareness of where the ball is at all times. He's kind of like that Malik Hooker. He's an opportunist. He's a guy that will take chances on balls when they're up in the air. Certainly with his size, he certainly has the ability to do so. One thing that, again, is my knock on Quincy Wilson as well. He just sometimes will, with that opportunistic approach, you oftentimes lose sight of where you need to be. I mean, that's why they drafted him a little bit later. But certainly his physical attributes are there that if they decided to convert him over, that certainly they could, because he's obviously, again, he's tall, he's strong, he's got good speed, and and he's got good awareness of where the ball is. I think that if he wanted to make the Colts roster, he's definitely I wouldn't know whether or not he would have to go at safety or corner, but certainly he's going to have some competition with Quincy Wilson for that. It's just a matter of can he find himself in the right position with coverages a lot more than what he was in college, because certainly if he wants to do the same thing he did in college, it's not going to cut it, because the NFL, they'll tear you to shreds if you're not a lot better in the zone coverage reads. So if he wants to make that roster, he's definitely going to have to hit the books and follow Eberfliss's scheme. And if he does so, then that is definitely a guy that, whether you put him at safety or at corner in the near future, that's definitely a guy that could be interesting to look out for in the coming years.
Yeah, and you mentioned he's got the size. He's prototypical for what the Colts are looking at. And I think that he's probably position flexible a little bit, where he can play some safety in a pinch, but it can also play corner as well. And so, so the next few guys that I want to kind of clump these guys together because I think they're all kind of in similar positions where, they've been in the NFL for a couple years now, and they're guys who have had success. They've been starters at one point. And I think these guys are interesting to me because ultimately one of these guys is going to get cut at least. I think one or a few of these guys are going to get cut at least. So I'll talk about a few of these players really fast and kind of get your thoughts on them and what they're going to have to do to make this roster. So the guys are Jalen Collins, former second-round pick, former Super Bowl starter for the Atlanta Falcons. And then we got Nate Hairston, who's a former fifth-round pick of the Colts in 2017, was a starter for them in 2017, kind of had a down year. And then I'll just throw Chris Milton in there as well. I don't think he was necessarily a starter, but he's been on the Colts now I think he was on their team last year. I don't know if he was on there in 2017, but really good special teams player for them. And so they got three guys here who I think have shots to make the roster. What do you think each one individually has to do to earn that spot as that probably potentially number 5 corner for the Colts?
Well, I can certainly tell you with Milton and with Hairston, those two are certainly the ones that I would assume are going to make the roster. Just because of, they've had that experience. They've come in and provided valuable minutes for the Colts when they are in. I know Hairston is a lot more of the guy that you see in on the defense. You see a lot more Milton in special teams, which, again, I think is another reason they keep him around, because he's definitely the guy that can help that position. Hairston, I think, needs to get a little better in run protection. I think he's been good in pass coverage when he's there, but I think that ultimately one thing that the Colts are really trying to get better at is that run defense on the outsides, and that's why, they obviously got Rocky Sin for that reason. I think Nate Hairston, if he can keep going with that, I think that's definitely what he needs to do. And again, Chris Milton, I have the same exact kind of thing that with Quincy Wilson. Obviously, he's sometimes out of place. That's just something that he's just going to have to get better at by studying film. Not much else that you can really say about that. He's obviously a very athletic guy, and he obviously is expandable because obviously they put him on special teams. But I think Hairston is definitely the guy that's going to take that next spot, just because I like the fact that they can move him around in several different spots on the defense. And he has the most experience out of all these guys. So I think ultimately that's what I expect for those guys coming to make up the bottom end of the roster spots for the corners.
Well, what about a guy like Jalen Collins, who is a former starter, second-round pick, drafted very highly out of LSU, a guy that has been there and done that for the Colts? Why do you think he doesn't make the roster?
I think there's a lot of questions about him. Obviously, there's obviously the questions of the health and for some other reasons that I don't know for a fact. But I think that ultimately Chris Ballard, again, is one of those guys that you pay your own. You pay the guys that you bring in a lot more of. Nate Hairston's been around for a little longer. Chris Milton's been around for a little longer. I think Jalen Collins is kind of the guy that they obviously brought in. They obviously want to see him compete. There's still just not enough yet for me to say definitively that I know he can make the roster. I mean, we've been talking about him for a while now, and I still haven't seen a lot. I hear everybody talk about, he has the chance to, but where is it? I don't see it. I'm not seeing it personally. Maybe somebody else has a different opinion of that than me, which I'm gladly willing to hear. I just think ultimately, if we're going with safe picks right now, from what I've seen, Chris Milton and Nate Hairston are those safe picks that I think ultimately Ballard and Frank Reich are most comfortable picking.
Hey all, Cody here. I just wanted to say first off, thank you so much for supporting my podcast. It really means a lot to have all your backing. If you haven't yet, be sure to hit that subscribe button and also put the bell on so you know when I post. You can always find my episodes here on YouTube, but if you're like me and you like listening to podcasts on the podcast app, you can find me there as well. Second, if you really like my podcast and you'd like to support me in some way, you can find me on Patreon. As much as I enjoy doing this, it also takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and also a little bit of my own personal funds. So if you'd ever want to support me on Patreon, you can find me there at patreon.com/Cody Felger Podcast. Again, that's patreon.com/Cody Felger Podcast. Thanks everyone, and go Colts.